Hello, everyone. Welcome. Yes, as Amanda said, my name is Kim Shank, and I am an educational consultant and trainer at the Capital Area Intermediate Unit. Um, and my colleague, Sarah Lobaugh, actually presented this training earlier in the week, so I am doing today. I'm actually presenting also at a local district, and they were just mowing the lawn. So that sound is gone now, thankfully. So hopefully we don't have any additional sound. If you could please take a moment in the chat to type where you're from and your position, I would appreciate it so we can get an idea of our audience. Again, if you're just joining us, type where you're from and your position.
So it looks like all the messages are coming directly to me. So let me go and, okay, everyone.
No, yep, I'm seeing some.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like some people direct message me.
Okay,
Sorry,
we
I
do
didn't
have
mean
some
to
local.
interrupt.
Yep, that's okay.
But we did have someone from North Dakota, which is awesome.
Oh, wow. Hi, Kristen. Oh, some Pittsburgh. I actually taught in Pittsburgh for a little bit. Nice. And a lot of PA people. Oh, Canada, Georgia. That's great. A lot of middle school reading intervention. Okay. High school English. Awesome. All right. Thank you for joining us. That really helps me get an idea of our audience. So here is today's key learning. Hopefully after today's session, you have an understanding of what disciplinary literacy is, and you're able to explain why disciplinary literacy is an essential component of adolescent literacy. And then the last part of our session will be to consider how disciplinary literacy practices impact your instruction. So let's get started. A quick little bit about me. Like I said, I have been at the Capital Area Intermediate Unit the past 2 years. Prior to that, I spent 13 years in public education, mainly as an intermediate and middle level English teacher. Taught in Pittsburgh, taught in the Harrisburg area, also in the Berks County area. So I've been around. I also have 2 little boys, and they are my why as to why I'm so passionate about literacy instruction and changing positive outcomes for kids. So let's get started. Our first objective, again, is explaining why disciplinary literacy is an essential component of adolescent literacy. So in order to do that, we need to first dive into some guiding models. The first being Chall's stages of reading development. So here you can see this infographic. I'm going to explain a little bit about that. Chall determined that reading skills develop in a hierarchy, and each skill layers upon the previous skill, which require higher cognitive processes, which then impact the comprehension of text. So this starts all the way down in preschool with pre-reading, moving to initial reading in early elementary school. We start to build our fluency and accuracy until we get to middle school, where we're hopefully then reading to learn new information. And as we get into high school, we're looking at multiple viewpoints, and then in college, construction and reconstruction. So another guiding model we want to talk about, and I'm sure you are familiar with Timothy and Cynthia Shanahan. So this guiding model comes from them. It's called the Increasing Specialization of Literacy Development. And this model basically conveys that literacy development shifts from basic literacy, which is our decoding and our knowledge of high frequency words, to intermediate literacy, which includes a number of common skills such as comprehension strategies, our knowledge of vocabulary, fluency, and then all the way to the top of the triangle to disciplinary literacy. And that's where it becomes highly specialized to specific disciplines such as history, mathematics, literature, etc. So teachers must move from transmitting information to showing students how to engage in the literacies that make up their discipline. And disciplinary literacy is a way of learning that drills deeply into the very essence of what it actually means to know the content. One other thing we need to consider, especially in the older grades, is what's called the curse of knowledge. So once you know something, and our content area teachers in the upper grades, they really know their content. They really know their discipline. It can sometimes be difficult to take the perspective of someone who doesn't. And you have to remember what it was like to be a novice in our area of expertise. So this can sometimes lead to miscommunication and misunderstandings. And in order to prevent this, we need to think about what students need to know and then try to avoid making assumptions.
Kim, your voice started to echo there for, I don't know if something changed with your mic.
Nope.
Okay.
Does it sound okay?
It's still echoing. It just changed like all of a sudden.
How about now?
That's good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks for letting me know. So therefore, as students move into the secondary grades, it's really essential that they have teachers who are knowledgeable about literacy practices related to their specific discipline, and then they're able to use them appropriately with their students. So under a disciplinary literacy approach, students use literacy to engage in goals and practices that are unique to each academic discipline. Students would gain practice with interpreting texts like a disciplinary literacy expert or a disciplinary expert would. So you're probably thinking, well, what about those reading strategies we learn about? Isn't that enough? Actually, readers must know something about the content in order to use a strategy effectively. So rather than just plugging in these pre-selected reading strategies, we want kids to be thinking about what and how they're reading. So believe it or not, the way we engage in specific texts in different disciplines can really vary, and students need to be knowledgeable and strategic as to how they approach that text. So literacy is also an inherent part of each discipline, and it supports content learning. And finally, students need to understand how reading, writing, and speaking and thinking all function in each discipline in order to gather multiple perspectives about the role of literacy and how that will serve them in their college or their career. So hopefully that gave you an understanding as to why disciplinary literacy is an essential component. And now we're going to go into defining exactly what it is. But before we do that, I have a little reading assignment for you. Y'all are probably thinking, yay, just what I want to do. So what I'd like you to do is we're going to take a minute to read this medical text on the screen. So I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to give you a minute, and then I'll tell you what we're going to do next. Okay. That was probably a gripping read, right? Okay, now in the chat, if you would, you can just pick one bullet to respond to and reflect on. How did it feel to read this text? What were some obstacles that you came across when trying to read the text? And what kinds of knowledge would a doctor have that would enable them to quickly understand what they were reading? So pick a bullet and respond. And we'll see what you guys thought. Mm-hmm. All right, I'm seeing some frustration, some confusion. A lot of you are saying the same thing about when it comes to vocabulary. I mean, we're adults, so we have knowledge of affixes and Greek and Latin roots, but if we didn't have that knowledge, it would be even harder. Yes, doctors are also familiar with the medical terminology, the acronyms. I know when I read this, I was confused about what was in parentheses. Was that the dosage? Like I didn't understand that. They would probably be able to write that and read that fairly well. Then the vocabulary, we talked about that as well. So yeah, that made that, and we didn't have the background knowledge. I mean, I'm not a doctor. I don't know if there's any doctors on here, but I doubt it. So we wanted to do that to give you an idea about why it's so important and what that might feel like if you don't have the vocabulary and the background knowledge and you don't know how to read a specific text, given the discipline that you're in. Okay, so rather than me just sitting here talking about disciplinary literacy, we want to honor you as adult learners. So I believe on the PDF, all of these are linked. I tried them out, so they should work. We want you to choose how you would like to learn a little bit more about disciplinary literacy. So you can choose to read the highlighted text on pages 2 to 3 of the disciplinary literacy strategies in content area classes that comes from Cynthia Shanahan. You could listen to this excerpt right here, 7:11 to 12:11 on a podcast.
Kim, you're echoing again.
Oh, goodness. And
I'm sorry.
Is that better?
Yep, sorry.
Just keep telling me. I'll just have to keep toggling between mics.
Okay.
And then there's also a video clip too that you can choose from. So all of these should take about 5 minutes. I'm going to set my timer for 5 minutes and we will come back to continue with the presentation. All right, if you could wrap that up, hopefully that just gave you a little bit of a taste of what disciplinary literacy is. And then we'll come back together. And obviously, if you'd like to read more, we just wanted to give you a little chunk of the most important content, but you have all three of those resources. Okay, so while we want to define disciplinary literacy, it's also important to distinguish how it's different from content literacy. So I think of content literacy being defined as very broad. Students are learning reading and writing processes that are common across all disciplines. For example, if they're interpreting text, they might be asking questions, they might be summarizing what they've read, they might be making predictions or using comprehension strategies and word analysis strategies. And then if they're having to compose text, they might be brainstorming their ideas, organizing them using a graphic organizer or an outline, using different revising and editing strategies, as well as a peer feedback protocol and getting feedback from the teacher. So very broad, that can be used in any discipline. So how is disciplinary literacy different? Well, this is when students use literacy to engage in goals and practices that are unique to each academic discipline. So typically we think of our math, our social studies and history, science, and then language arts specifically. But for example, if they're interpreting text in math, they may need to evaluate and critique the solutions to a problem that their peers have given. If they're in history, they may corroborate evidence across sources. Or if they're in a health or nutrition class, they might need to read a nutrition label and then be able to compare and contrast different food labels to make healthy choices. So additionally, they also need to learn the features if they're, having to write within a discipline, the features that are common, features are of common genres within each discipline, and then be able to evaluate and revise their writing according to that discipline specific criteria. So overall, content literacy is very broad and can be applied to many different disciplines or tasks, but disciplinary literacy focuses on the what and the how students are reading and how they're then composing text related to that specific discipline. So hopefully that helps distinguish between the two. Sometimes people get those confused or use them interchangeably. All right, so before Jamboard goes away, we're going to do one. The Jamboard is linked here. And Amanda or Karen, if you also wouldn't maybe mind dropping the link in the chat, that would be great. It's also on the slides. You can link that, access the link there. And essentially what we'd like for you to do is we want to see what you already know about disciplinary literacy and what activities may be used in specific disciplines. So once you access the Jamboard, you'll see a picture that looks like the image here. And for example, if we consider math, I want you to think about what texts are being used in math. How might students need to use claims and evidence in math? And what literacy practices might a teacher use to support those texts within math? So we're going to try to work together to fill in this table on the Jamboard and see what we come up with. So I'm also going to exit out of here and pull up the Jamboard. And we'll give about 5 minutes. If you're not familiar with Jamboard, once you open it, there is like a sticky note feature. You can also add a text box, or you can actually like write with a pen. So whatever works for you.
Kim, you have an echo again.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Some of you are talking about building background knowledge and vocabulary. Absolutely. I think that could apply to any of them, but try to be a little more specific. Think about specifically in history and social studies, or specifically in science, like what do they need to do to read and write in that discipline? Nice job. Getting some real specific answers here. Take about 1 more minute. See if you can come up with anything else. What else might they read in a science class? That one seems to be lacking some. Okay. All right. You guys did a great job with this. There's definitely some I see like, oh, I see periodic table. Yeah. Whew, that's tricky to read. Um, some of these are a little small, so I'm trying my best to read them. Definitely in science, being able to read experiments, test hypotheses, lots of informational text, lab reports and research articles, absolutely. Um, document-based questions in history and social study, primary sources, diaries, journals, outlines, timelines, absolutely. Okay, so I'm seeing you do know some examples of these. There are some I see missing, so hopefully we can build on your understanding of these and talk about some additional texts we could read and some additional practices we can use with our students. All right, so let's get back in here. All right. So given what we learned about content literacy versus disciplinary literacy, you're probably thinking, okay, so what should I be doing with my adolescent readers in the classroom? Well, the answer is use an integrated approach. Students can practice common literacy strategies in addition to using more discipline-specific frameworks and practices as they read and write texts within each discipline. Additionally, you want to know your students. So instruction works best when teachers connect educational standards to students' interests, backgrounds, home languages, and their family. And as you start to make the shift and try to incorporate more disciplinary literacy strategies, you want to rely less on generic reading strategies and more on discipline-specific literacy practices. You can do that by showing students how experts in the field read relevant texts and then discuss how experts in the field read, write, speak, and think in each discipline. You obviously want to provide a lot of practice. So students need access to a variety of texts of varying lengths for each discipline, and they need you to model the language of the discipline through reading aloud. Yes, we can still read aloud in the secondary grades, and think aloud. So we're going to take a minute to do a little processing activity, and I always like to provide you with a choice. So you can pick from one of these three activities to just reflect on what you've learned about disciplinary literacy. So you can type it in the chat, you can write it, you don't have to share it, you can draw it, and just pick one. What is the difference between content literacy practices and disciplinary literacy practices? You could use an analogy. Disciplinary literacy is like blank because blank, or draw an image that conveys the meaning of disciplinary literacy and why it's essential for adolescents. So take a minute to give you guys time to reflect. I love a good analogy, so if anyone comes up with a good one, I'd love to hear it in the chat. we'll keep it moving then. So this is my favorite part of the presentation. So now we are going to consider how disciplinary literacy practices impact our instruction. And we're going to walk through the 4 main disciplines and dig a little bit deeper into each one, starting with science. So again, as we were planning this presentation, literacy encompasses more than just reading, but for the sake of time in an hour, we are only really going to dive into reading. So I do have referenced the sources that we've used. There is specifically a great book that we got a lot of this information from that you can see cited. So if you'd like to know more, I highly recommend reading that book front to back. It's got a lot of good information. So let's start with science. So how do scientists read? Okay, some of you have pulled some of that information when we talked about the Jamboard. So they have to assume an objective stance. They are answering questions and searching for answers to the questions that they pose. They are asking why more than what. They have to figure out that question. Why is that happening? They evaluate not only the quality, but the quantity of evidence and validity of sources. They seek to understand concepts and vocabulary. They need to collaborate with their colleagues when faced with complex issues. They have to be able to chart, illustrate, and graph their data and the conclusions that they draw from that data. And they have to understand that theories are subject to change and that they need to keep seeking out more current findings. So what do scientists read? Some of you had pulled some of this information already, some that we didn't talk about. Infographics is another one. Proposals, like a written proposal, diagrams, mathematical equations were some that I didn't see listed on the Jamboard. You can also see some examples of diagrams, drawings, graphs, and maps that might be found in a scientific text. Additionally, again, at the end of these slides, I have this whole resource link that has tons of videos and lots of great information, but we're just gonna watch a very brief video clip on students using science in the real world. And hopefully the volume works.
What are we up to today?
So we're going to do a capture experiment. We made a change in the functionalization process.
We can't accomplish this goal of building a portable device without literacy skills. There's actually literacy embedded in everything that we do. Vocabulary is important because we have people from many different backgrounds working on this project.
All right, I'm getting ready to prime my card.
We spend a whole lot of time talking to each other about, this is the problem that I'm seeing, these are the issues that I'm dealing with.
You know, as I was putting the drops on the cards, I noticed they're really hydrophobic.
If you can't communicate to me, then I can't really help you.
They're changing it right now, and the new one's gonna have a lower autofluorescence.
It's ready.
Writing skills and especially speaking skills are important in our staff.
Each field or each project starts developing its own lingo. Can you double check the weld around the dog leg to make sure that we don't have that same problem we had before?
Absolutely.
Thanks.
In addition to speaking skills, in science we need to be able to read and analyze a lot of data. Not just numbers and words, but sometimes we're reading and interpreting an image of cells. That's also scientific literacy.
So here you can see the CD4 cells captured. And this is great. We see a homogeneous distribution of the cells.
We still see some air.
Okay, so today Yvonne and I are going to talk to you about our results from some of our recent lyophilized antibody experiments.
Then we have to explain our analysis to our colleagues. That starts with writing an explanation of your results and then sharing them with your team. Sometimes we say that if you didn't present the data, then you didn't do the experiment.
A couple of purposes of this experiment. First of all, in general, we wanted to compare the capture.
This experiment was looking at 2 different possible chemical signatures that could give us a reading from the cards that go in our device. And we were looking to see which chemical would give us the most accurate results.
Now there's higher platelets in the ELV test group compared to the LVLV. And we don't actually understand that yet, but it has been something that we've been observing
The importance of any presentation of your data is really just to be able to get a lot of feedback.
Yeah, I think that we need to reevaluate our thresholds because
You can look at your data, you can stare at it all day, and sometimes you just don't see something someone else can see.
I mean, another theory.
All right. I think we get the gist of that. But oh my goodness, I don't know about you, but I was feeling like the medical text that we read. There was a lot of challenging vocabulary there, as well as a lot of interpreting graphs, charts. And again, we're just talking about the reading today, but there's a lot of writing, specific writing and speaking skills they need within each discipline that you could see through that video. So let's move on to history. So how do historians and social scientists read? Well, some of you pulled out the fact that they are reading different documents, visuals, maps, pictures, but they need to be able to compare and contrast those. That's really important. They also need to be able to interpret those primary and secondary sources, and they need to have an eye towards bias. They need to know what bias is and be able to identify it within those. They also need to be able to create a narrative from existing information and use their knowledge of the present to make sense of the past and vice versa. A lot of you mentioned the timelines. They need to be able to think sequentially to piece all of that information together and make inferences to determine what's most important. They also need to be able to untangle threads of fact from often conflicting accounts and perspectives, because history is telling a story and an account of what happened, and sometimes our bias can get in the way of that. And they also need to be able to determine meanings of words in context. So a lot of specific skills needed when they're reading in history class. So you were able to pick out some of these, some that I didn't see on the Jamboard. Documentaries are a big one, political cartoons, blogs, articles, speeches, debates, paintings, artifacts, memoirs were some that I didn't see on the Jamboard. So again, here's an example of a primary source document. I apologize for the background noise. They are blowing grass where I am. Great timing. I apologize. A resource that I wanted to share with you that is really cool, again, linked at the end of the slide. This information comes from the Digital Inquiry Group, and these are actually posters that you can download, I believe for free. And they offer prompts to encourage critical thinking related to tasks specific to the discipline of history. So, for example, when close reading, this poster has some prompts that students should be thinking about, such as the claims the author makes, as well as evidence the author uses. It's also important to note when talking about history, the context. So when was this happening? Where was it happening? What was going on in history? So the contextualization poster encourages students to think about where and when that document was created, and then consider similarities and differences within that historical time period compared to the present. The corroboration poster also offers some prompts to help students synthesize information from multiple documents in order to draw conclusions. And then finally, that sourcing poster there just really gets students to critically evaluate a source using those listed prompts. So really great if you want to take a look at those. Moving on to math, which was my hardest subject in school because we start putting letters in math problems, right? So how do mathematicians read? Well, they use information and they read it like a puzzle that needs to be solved because they have to figure out an answer. We bring in symbols and abstract ideas, and we need to make meaning from those. We're also looking for patterns and relationships. And we're reading word problems. And we really need to seek to understand when reading a word problem, because there's usually multiple steps. We're asking questions, we're making notes on misconceptions or confusions, and we need to read for accuracy because, there's one right answer. You have to be accurate. Our knowledge continues to build, so we have to apply previously learned mathematical concepts in what we're doing. And then we also have to think about our mathematical vocabulary and understand that words have multiple meanings, and we need to use them sometimes differently in math class. So reading within math, what do mathematicians read? I did see word problems. One that I didn't see were those mathematical proofs. They have to be able to read equations and symbols, graphs, tables, journal articles, all the things. On the right, you'll see a very, very large word problem that looks quite overwhelming to me. But you would have to show them how to navigate that, how to solve that. And hopefully you can hear this, but I am going to show you a brief video clip of an epidemiologist in the field and how she uses math in the real world.
In the field of epidemiology, you need a multidisciplinary toolbox. It's very important to use literacy skills, reading, writing, speaking, and listening to explain patterns in data. Black women are a very understudied population and a very overburdened population for a number of health outcomes.
So gingivitis is not gum disease. It's inflammation, irritation.
I do some research on neighborhood socioeconomic status, and Yvette does research on racism and discrimination.
That's what I was thinking of. That's what I was kind of wait.
By working with the Black Women's Health Study, we are bringing attention to the research, which we do by giving people numbers.
And then, is bone loss clear?
It is the largest follow-up study of African American women in the United States ever conducted. It's hard to prevent things that you don't understand why they happen, and understanding and controlling disease is important. This discipline called epidemiology is deciphering and finding patterns of disease and trying to explain them.
It's very important to be able to read documents and really synthesize information and be able to pull out questions that are answered and questions that are left unanswered, and being able to translate that information so someone who doesn't have all the background that I have can know something more about public health.
Because I did fix that and then rerun all the tables.
All right.
Yvette and I were looking at a manuscript.
This is the 12th draft, and I've added an abstract since the last draft.
What you want is for someone to read the abstract and have an idea of what you've done very clearly, so they know whether or not they want to read the entire paper.
So I added the numbers of total deaths, cancer deaths, cardiovascular deaths.
Once we've published that research is available for someone to use it as evidence when they're putting together a policy brief, or evidence when they're going to a town hall and saying that we need changes in our neighborhood. When I'm doing an analysis, I'm trying to decide, what do these numbers mean? So with the data that I have available, all of my numbers, do I see a difference that means something mathematically? Is this something that we should be concerned about from a public health standpoint? So there was previous literature that suggested that there was a relationship between obesity and lung cancer, but because we didn't know what to expect in our population, which are Black women, we definitely had to go through all those steps to make sure that our data is valid. We did a study looking at body mass index, waist circumference, and waist to hip ratio in relation to lung cancer in the Black Women's Health Study, and it was our first analysis of lung cancer, which was really exciting. You really need to understand the kind of data you're looking at, really the types of numbers you're looking at, what they represent, what sort of analytic models you'd use for those types of data. And then if you use a model, what does that number really mean? And what does it tell you? And then as I start getting some numbers, we meet and get some feedback. You know, what do we see happening? What are the important patterns?
We're going to be talking about the Black Women's Health Study Supplemental Dental Survey. We want to talk today about formatting that questionnaire.
We meet and talk about the questions that we're asking, the way we're asking them, the responses that are available, because we want to do the best job possible to make sure that when we ask a question, what they're genuinely answering is what we're picking up in our data.
So these are the quality of life questions. So during the past 3 months, how often have you experienced the following difficulties because of problems with your teeth, mouth, or dentures?
There are some questions where we want to be very careful that we're not stigmatizing people. It's important to think about, if I am not the researcher and I read this, what would it say to me?
Do you think they would take issue with us replacing disagree with not at all?
We'd have to decide if we want to make that type of change. And if
when you're dealing with a population that has been understudied or a population that has been overburdened, I think you have to take time and make sure that, okay, this questionnaire has been validated. Who was it validated on? What was that population? Could that population have looked at these questions differently? My way of advocating is doing the studies that I think that are important and that are interesting and getting the numbers out there to say that the community feels that there's a problem. We can show you that there is a problem. And one of the things that people really respond to is data. This research, we believe, is going to improve health for Black women, health for everyone. You know, when one group comes up, everybody comes up together.
All right. So as I was reading that, or as I was watching that video, I kept thinking, like,
Kim,
how,
you have an echo again.
all right.
Thank you.
And the guy's back here. You can't make this up.
We can't hear that though, so you're good.
Okay, good. But I definitely saw her making meaning from symbols, looking for patterns and relationships in the data, asking a lot of questions. But then also, again, the part that we didn't see is how is she conveying that information? How is she, there's a whole other writing piece that we haven't addressed in this presentation. So a lot involved in her job, really interesting stuff. Okay, and the last discipline we're going to talk about is language arts, English language arts. So reading within English language arts. How do readers of fiction and nonfiction approach text? So here we have fiction, we have characters, we have settings, we have conflicts, and those things may influence meaning. We also have figurative language. We need to be able to understand it and interpret it, which is really hard sometimes for students. Along with theme, we have to be able to analyze underlying messages that evolve throughout fiction. My favorite is being able to discern an unreliable narrator or character by being a skeptical reader. What makes them reliable? Can we trust them or not? We need to recognize our literary devices, the components of a plot, read critically, looking for bias or fallacies in reasoning, make connections within a text and between texts, use our text structures as a tool for comprehension, and obviously paying attention to new vocabulary. That's one we've seen in every discipline. So what do readers of fiction and nonfiction read? You did say novels. I saw novels, short stories, literature. We did talk about poetry. Drama is another one I didn't see on the Jamboard. Essays, articles, and speeches as well. So I have two examples here on the screen. One is a soliloquy from Romeo and Juliet. We know that time period and the language that they used and the time period is very complex. So that can be challenging for students. And then we also see the novel, The Great Gatsby, which, if you're not familiar with that, has a lot of symbolism, such as the green light, the Valley of Ashes. Those are examined in depth. and contribute to the novel's themes of wealth, ambition, and the American dream. So a lot of symbolism, a lot of theme that can be challenging for students to understand. But if you notice, each one of these disciplines had something different and specific about it. So when you have, for example, a science or a social studies teacher say, I'm not a reading teacher, I don't need to do these things in my class, they are using literacy in a very specific way. We just essentially have to unlock how and why and help students navigate that. So here are some quick examples of things that you can incorporate, next year with your students to get them reading in every discipline every day. The first is current event short takes. So basically, this is where you would provide a relevant current event on a regular basis to increase relevance, interest, and learning. So you could do this at the beginning of a lesson. You could chunk a bigger article over a period of days. You could create a section on your LMS with different links for students who finish early to explore. And linked on the PDF, you'll see I have a Padlet of some curated websites that have good news articles for adolescent readers. So if you're looking for a resource, you can check that out, because I know some of them, I know I used to use News ELA. That's no longer free, unfortunately. So I know that was a barrier for some teachers. How do I find these articles? So there's some great examples there. Additionally, teachers can read aloud complex text with students. So it's never too old for a read aloud, as long as it's purposeful and worthy of being read aloud with students. So students will be able to gain content knowledge, which we want, because that barrier, if they can't access the text because it's too challenging to read, you can help them with that. And they can also hear the cadence and prosody of a proficient reader. So those texts should be engaging. We want to set a purpose for listening. What is the point of them hearing this text? You can also share a visual or a link to the full text so they can follow along. And then you want to think aloud and model the questions you're asking regarding the author, the facts, or the sources. And then stop and do that partner discussion routine to get them engaging with the text and processing that together. You could also incorporate visuals. I've included that digital inquiry group link down here as well, and some questions. They're great questions that can help students interpret a visual. But remember, visuals are more than just pictures. They can be infographics. I have an example linked here, charts, graphs, political cartoons, taking away that barrier of the print, but can also give them some additional information that can increase their ability to learn also if you pair it with print. So it's another great idea. And finally, we want to get students collaborating with challenging text. So students can work with partners or groups to comprehend and derive meaning from text. These things should be short, challenging, and complex enough to engage students over multiple readings. So an example I gave here was a speech from Elie Wiesel. It paired nicely with a Holocaust unit, and really challenging enough that students would have to engage with that in multiple reads. So a support that can help you with that. This is a visual to help you dig a little deeper with close reading, getting to read that text multiple times. You can, in the first read, just get that surface level information. And then during that second read, you want them to think about how the text works, like what's the structure, how are the sentences working together through the syntax, what's the author's purpose for writing. And then the third read really helps them uncover what the text means and what is being implied. And that's going to help them build that mental model of the text so that they can use that information for future applications. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. So I'd love for you in our last 2 minutes or so to just reflect. What did you come thinking about disciplinary literacy? What did you learn? And how is that going to change your practice moving forward? So I have a little sentence stem there if you'd like to fill that out. And then we will turn it over to Amanda, and she has some closing remarks, and I believe we have time for questions.